When 3 Imperial spies snuck into Tempest, they thought my dungeon was a game. They figured out the traps, memorized the boss patterns, and started treating the whole thing like a very profitable vacation. And then they opened the door to floor 60. Let's just say the Empire's intelligence reports were about to need a serious update. If you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the algorithm find more people who love the series, and your support keeps these episodes going. Now, let's see how our uninvited guests handle the Labyrinth. Tempest's capital was supposed to be gone. That was the report Shinji, Marc, and Zhen had heard. The city had been razed, the people had vanished, and only the dungeon gate remained. But when they arrived, the city was packed with people, noise, food, and the kind of clean, lively streets none of them expected from a monster nation. Even for otherworlders, it was hard not to stare. The Empire's capital in Nazca had its comforts, and Yuuki had done a lot to improve the way people lived around him. But the towns outside the capital still smelled like livestock and old roads. Tempest did not. It felt modern. It felt deliberate. It felt like someone had taken pieces of their old world and planted them here, then let the whole city grow around them. Shinji slowed near the gate. I thought this whole place was supposed to be empty. Marc looked around at the crowds. Maybe they can switch it on and off. Or maybe whoever checked before saw an illusion. Zhen's voice stayed quiet. We should not relax. That was enough to bring them back to themselves. Kagali had carried them here through Warp Portal, using her previous visit to Tempest as the anchor. She had left almost immediately after that. Gadora would meet them later and handle the return trip, but until then their orders were simple. Investigate as much as possible without doing anything stupid. None of them intended to die for curiosity. They passed the entry inspection with the free guild cards Yuuki had provided, found an inn, and began their so-called intelligence work by walking through town. It did not take long for the mission to start feeling dangerous in a completely different way. There were street stalls selling takoyaki, okonomiyaki, yakisoba, crepes, cakes, and curry rice. There were cafes, casual restaurants, and expensive places that somehow had ingredients Shinji could not imagine sourcing in this world. The locals treated it like normal life now, but to the 3 of them it was overwhelming. Shinji nearly teared up when he saw curry on a menu. The bathrooms were clean, the inn was comfortable. It even had an open-air bath, not as a noble luxury, but as entertainment for ordinary customers. Marc finally said what all 3 of them were thinking. What if we just lived here? Shinji flinched. Don't joke about that. Marc raised a hand. I'm kidding. Mostly. I'm not mad, Shinji said. I'm just way too ready to consider it. Zhen looked away. I would live here too. That killed the joke. For a moment they just stood there, forced to admit that the Empire was not the whole world. Tempest was cheaper, freer, and more entertaining than anything available to common citizens in Imperial territory. The Empire had culture, but most of it belonged to nobles. Here, people were eating well, bathing well, and inventing games for anyone with spare coins. Marc tried to laugh it off. Shinji tried to talk himself out of it. Zhen reminded them that desertion could end in a firing squad. And then there was the coming war. Tempest was clearly a target, and the 3 of them understood the Empire's military strength too well to imagine this city would escape untouched. So they set the temptation aside and followed their orders. They entered the Labyrinth. By the time they reached floor 40, their first fear had worn down into gamer confidence. Shinji had grown up with RPGs, and Marc knew enough games to follow his thinking. Zhen had less experience with that sort of thing, but he could read danger better than either of them. Together, they started seeing the dungeon less like an unknown death maze and more like a vicious, over-designed game. That did not make it kind, it made it understandable. The traps were cruel, but Zhen detected them with absurd consistency. The monsters were dangerous, but once the traps were handled, the trio had enough power to deal with them. Shinji figured the main reason locals struggled was that this whole design language was new to them. To an otherworlder who understood dungeons, boss floors, gimmicks, and loot systems, it had a shape. And then there was the resurrection bracelet. They had researched it before entering. The front desk even issued one for free. If a challenger died inside the dungeon, the bracelet returned them to the entrance alive. It was such an insane rule that none of the three knew how to process it at first. This world was full of real violence and real death, and someone had built a place where death functioned like a reset. The economy around it was just as strange. At stairways, challengers could access inn floors. Merchants bought unneeded drops. Food and drinks were available, and the clerk cheerfully repeated Sir Rimuru's mysterious policy about refreshments being under 300 yen. Shinji did not know whether to be impressed or insulted that the entire dungeon crawl had been turned into a business model. A week later, the three of them were sitting in an inn room counting the proof that the model worked. Marc stared at their haul. Are we making a ridiculous amount of money, or is it just me? Shinji opened a bag and let the gold coins catch the light. Between monster materials, treasure, bounties, and rewards, they had earned several dozen gold coins and even a stellar. That was not pocket money, that was serious income. They had also become the second party to reach floor 50. Masayuki's group had reached that area first, but everyone else was still stalled near the floor 40 boss. Shinji's party had even been named Dungeon Party of the Month. The Tempest Serpent on floor 40 had been strong. It was an A- monster with a dangerous breath attack and a body like metal. But compared to what Shinji, Marc, and Zhen could do together, it had not stopped them for long. The real shock was the loot. Slot weapons had begun appearing around floor 40. They had recessed sockets none of their appraisal magic could explain, and merchants paid alarming prices for them while refusing to explain why. The weapons were clearly well made, but something about those slots made them more valuable than the trio understood. Then Marc found the Minos Bardiche. It was a unique class poleaxe of polished mithril, one from the treasure chest after the floor 50 guardian. Marc could barely stop showing it off. A unique, Marc said, grinning like a boy with a festival prize. You don't see these in the Empire. That was true. Ordinary Imperial officers did not walk around with unique weapons. Imperial Guardians might be issued Legend-class gear, but everyone below that used sturdy, mass-produced equipment. Even Magisteel was hard to make in quantity. Shinji knew the theory. Leave equipment in a high magicule environment for hundreds or thousands of years, and if it found a worthy owner, it might evolve. Marc did not want to hear anything that made his treasure sound mass-produced. But Shinji could not shake the thought. The Bardiche had a slot. Other slotted weapons were circulating through Tempest. People said they could appear in chests from floor 30 onward. If a nation could hand out gear like this and then applaud when outsiders walked away with it, how much power did that nation actually have? No one at the front desk confiscated the weapon. Instead, the employees congratulated them, applauded, and gave them another bonus. Tempest, Marc concluded, was insane, and yet the madness was tempting. They could earn more in the dungeon than they did in the army, have more fun, and sleep in better beds. The only thing waiting for them in the Empire was duty, war, and the death penalty if they were branded deserters. Shinji forced the topic back to practical matters. The next day, they would go below floor 50. That section was called the Haven of the Dead. Marc's Minos Bardiche was mithril and carried the holy attribute, so it should be perfect against undead and ghosts. That too felt like a game. Beat one boss, receive the tool that helped with the next zone. The pattern had been clear so far. A black spider, an evil centipede, an ogre lord with minions, the Tempest Serpent, and then Bovix, a talking magic-born Tauroid who guarded floor 50. The bosses were getting stronger at an ugly rate. Shinji suspected floor 60 might be the bottom. He had also heard rumors of 100 floors, but he kept that to himself. No reason to crush everyone's morale early. We can't die, Shinji told them, so we stay careful and see how far this goes. 3 days after that, after poisoned swamps and corroded wastelands, they reached the stairs toward floor 60. They had rested, they were prepared. They knew the guardian ahead would probably be another sentient monster, maybe worse than Bovix. All three agreed to go all out from the start. Then they opened the door. A little before that, I was in my chamber working on our surveillance problem. Soe's people and Moss's agents were stationed all over the important routes through the forest of Jura. We were watching the coastline from Farminus up toward northern Anglecia, plus the mountains in between. On paper, our coverage looked pretty good. In practice, I hated the delay. If a two-person scout team was wiped out, information from that area stopped immediately. Even if they survived but had to fight, reports would be late. A late report in wartime could get a nation killed. So I started looking for a safer way to watch enemy movements. There were distant view spells and shamanistic magic, but they were clumsy. They focused on one place at a time, gave limited information, and bounced off barriers. Useful for checking a location, not enough for controlling a war. That led me back to Megiddo. Megiddo used suspended water droplets as lenses to focus sunlight. If I reworked that principle, maybe I could use water lenses to observe distant places instead. Maybe I could transmit the image to a monitor. Maybe, with physical magic, spirit magic, and dominate space, I could build the magical equivalent of a surveillance satellite. Raphael informed me that it was possible, which meant the hard part was basically solved. Information wins wars. If I knew where the Empire moved and how they divided their forces, I could concentrate our own strength where it mattered. If they spread out, we could break them apart. If I spread out blindly, we could lose despite all our power. The monitoring magic was not a toy. It was strategic infrastructure. All right, yes, we already had the test system working. What I was really asking Raphael for was more like a usability upgrade. And since Raphael is my skill, I feel completely justified in saying I was working very hard. I was enjoying Shuna's tea and thinking about taking a short break from all my hard work when Beretta's urgent thought communication came in. A second party had beaten floor 50. The first had been Masayuki's team, and they had done wonders for dungeon business. Challengers were pouring in, trying reckless strategies under the no-death rule. Some used repeated death as a tactic. Some sacrificed one member so the rest could keep going. It sounded ridiculous, but the dungeon had become a training ground, entertainment venue, and money engine all at once. Most parties still hit their limit at floor 40, where the Tempest Serpent destroyed them and sent them back to buy or rent better equipment. That black snake had become a very reliable source of profit, but now someone else had defeated the floor 50 Guardian. That mattered. Bovix and Equix took turns guarding that floor, and both had grown a lot stronger after I named them. If a new party could beat one of them without Masayuki-level luck involved, they were either very good, very dangerous, or both. I had also placed a special first clear reward there. One random item from the unique class Minos series. The weapons and armor were absurd-looking, powerful, and handcrafted by Kurobi's best apprentices. I did not have many complete sets made yet, because I honestly thought it would take longer for anyone to reach that point. Losing a piece hurt a little. The bigger issue was the party that won it. If they were friendly, I wanted to recruit them. If they were not, I wanted them watched. So I went to the Labyrinth command room. Ramiris and Veldora were already there, bright-eyed and completely unbothered by the coming war. Ramiris greeted me like a naval officer reporting to her commander, though I had no idea what exactly she thought she was reporting. On the large screen were 3 young men. One was big, brown-haired, and dressed in a tank top and jeans, which basically screamed otherworlder. He fought by grabbing and throwing the air itself, compressing it into brutal blasts. Another was small and hidden inside a black robe. The third wore chainmail under a lab coat. A lab coat, in a dungeon. They were fighting 6 death wolves when I arrived. One death wolf was a B+ monster. 6 together were dangerous enough to shred most parties, especially since they were ghost types that ignored normal melee attacks. But Tank Top drew the Minos Bardiche and cut down 3 in one swing, so that was where my unique weapon had gone. The Bardiche was mithril, a mix of magisteel and silver, and it carried holy attributes. It was designed to tear through undead and ghosts. Watching him handle it so naturally after only a short time made Veldora nod in approval. The black-robed boy was just as troublesome in a different way. He marked traps before they triggered. The floors beyond 50 were full of poison lakes, acid swamps, corrosive gas, oxygenless rooms, rotating passages, and other traps meant to make challengers suffer. Yet he saw through them, found routes, and kept the group moving. The lab coat leader had done very little until the Bovix fight. When Raphael showed me the memory, I saw him inject his allies, then fill the room with a poison gas tailored to slow Bovix down. After that, he finished the job with a silver scalpel. He was a healer, a commander, and a killer when needed. The party balance was excellent. Shuna arrived with their immigration records. The names were Shinji, age 23, magician, Marc, age 26, warrior, and Zhen, age 17, huntmaster. Their story was that they were from a small Imperial province and had come because a merchant told them about the dungeon. Sure, very believable. Raphael confirmed that all three possessed unique skills. Their listed professions were also too specialized to ignore. A magician meant advanced training in multiple magic families. A warrior meant mastery of martial arts and weapons. A huntmaster meant elite hunting ability, including danger detection and hard-to-learn arts. 3 people like that just happening to form a party and wander into Tempest right before a war? That was not coincidence. Diablo, who had been standing in the background with his usual silent intensity, agreed that they looked like spies who had taken the bait. The bait, in this case, was the empty city trick. Ramiris's Mazcraft had become even more absurd than I thought. She could treat the ground-level city above the dungeon as another floor, meaning we could sequester the entire capital inside the labyrinth for a full day. Air and water were fine, the sun was still visible. It took a ridiculous amount of energy, but Veldora supplied that problem away. That became the foundation of our evacuation plans. If Imperial agents came to investigate the vanished city, all they would find was the suspicious dungeon gate. We expected someone to take the bait eventually. And now, here they were. Veldora wanted to know whether we should arrest them immediately. I decided not to. They were useful as a test case, useful as publicity, and useful as bait for more information. If things went badly, I could always arrest them later and confiscate what they had earned. Veldora and Ramiris praised the plan as both dirty and brilliant. Shuna just looked tired of us. The only problem was floor 60. Adalmann guarded it as the immortal king. I had expected him to serve as the final test of the undead zone, but Marc now had a holy attribute Minos Bardiche. Against a white, that sounded like a terrible matchup. Adalmann was better as a commander than a duelist, and I had already started preparing myself to apologize if the challengers ran over him. Adalmann did not share my doubts. In his city of the dead, he smiled with fleshless jaws as the intruders approached. Alberto, his old companion and now a death paladin, stood ready beside him. The death dragon, his enormous undead pet, waited as well. Adalmann's devotion had only deepened since joining me. His faith was honestly too intense for my comfort, but it had pushed him to train. He wanted to serve the demon lord who had given him a place to exist. He wanted to win. The fight began, and then it ended almost immediately. I had brought cards in case the battle dragged on. I never used them. Adalmann's side did not just win, they dominated so completely that I stared at the screen with my mouth open. On paper, Shinji's party was frightening. Raphael identified the lab coat leader's unique skill as Restorer, giving him control over tiny viruses and pathogens. He could destroy living creatures from inside, fill the air with lethal clouds, and use the same principle for healing. Marc's Hurler let him throw anything he could lift, and with gravity control magic that made him terrifying against armies. Zhen's Observer let him sense threats, find traps and monsters, and avoid danger before it arrived. As a trio, they were perfectly designed to break a dungeon, but Adalmann had changed. Ramiris proudly explained that after receiving new equipment from me, Adalmann and Alberto had trained like maniacs. The dungeon's high magicule concentration had done the rest. Adalmann had regained power as a White King. Alberto had become a Death Paladin. The Death Dragon was real, apparently known to everyone except me, which said something unfortunate about our internal reporting. The actual battle barely involved Adalmann or the dragon. Alberto stepped forward alone. Marc's Minos Bardiche met Alberto's cursed sword and stopped cold. Alberto cut Marc down before the weapon could show off. Zhen froze for only an instant, but Alberto moved like a blur and finished him too. Shinji fired Holy Cannon as a last resort, landing a direct hit. Alberto did not even bother to dodge. The holy attack failed because Adalmann had developed a hidden skill called Holy Evil Inversion. Raphael explained that it swapped holy and evil attributes. Adalmann had turned Alberto from evil to holy, neatly removing the normal undead weakness. His cursed equipment remained cursed, but since Alberto had no life force for the gear to drain, that did not matter. A holy undead knight. It sounded like a joke. Unfortunately for Shinji's party, it was real. They disappeared into particles of light, resurrected out of the chamber by their bracelets. Adalmann raised his voice to the screen, dedicating the victory to me with far too much enthusiasm. I congratulated him and invited him to the control room, along with Alberto. The death dragon wanted to come too, but it was nearly 40 feet long, so I told Adalmann to leave it guarding the floor. Shuna offered tea when they arrived. Then she asked whether a skeleton could drink tea. That was a fair question, but also not one I wanted spoken out loud. Alberto at least could form a temporary body from magicules and seemed able to enjoy the flavor. Adalmann preferred his skeletal image, which I decided not to question. If the man wanted to remain a dramatic skeleton king, that was his business. I praised them, then asked about holy evil inversion. That led to an unexpected explanation. Luminous had taught Adalmann day-night inversion as an apology for the 7 days clergy incident, and Beretta had helped modify it with Reverser. Adalmann refined it into his own secret technique. That made me think of Granville, of the old schemes around Adalmann, and of how much talent had almost been wasted by people obsessed with their own positions. But this was not the time to say any of that. Instead, I made a practical decision. Adalmann's team was too strong for floor 60. The zone beyond them, floors 61 through 70, was the Golem Zone, filled with inorganic sentries, landmines, firearms tests, and the Demon Colossus. The Demon Colossus was an upgraded elemental colossus with magisteel defenses, Charybdis scale shielding, magic interference, and remote control capability. Against Shinji's viruses, it would have been a nightmare, but Veldora judged Adalmann stronger. So we promoted Adalmann's group to floor 70 and had Ramiris swap the undead zone with the golem zone. The dungeon's hierarchy changed right there. As that conversation ended, Diablo reported that Raisin had sent a magical call. Raisin's former teacher wanted an audience with me. His name was Gadora. I did not know the name off the top of my head, but Raphael supplied that he was a famous author of sorcery texts. Xian immediately suspected a trap. Diablo dismissed Raisin as barely worth listening to, which sounded less like strategy and more like his personal opinion. I was leaning toward refusing until I noticed Adalmann getting restless. When I asked, he admitted that Gadora might be an old friend of his. More than 1,000 years ago, Gadora had been close to Adalmann and had cast reincarnation on him to save his life. Adalmann also recognized Razin as one of Gadora's main apprentices. That changed things. I called Diablo's name and he understood before I needed to explain. He would arrange a date and time. While we were deciding that, Shinji's party was waking up from death for the first time. They returned not to silence, but to an audience. People were cheering them, pitying them, booing them, and shouting advice all at once. Their boss fights had been broadcast live. Shinji had signed the optional broadcast contract because it paid a cut of the fees and made the party famous enough that assassinating them would be harder. Since only boss fights were broadcast, the contract had seemed worth the risk. Now they were celebrities. The crowd wanted to talk about the knight, the skeleton king, the dragon, and whether any human could possibly beat what they had just seen. Some people placed them beside Masayuki in the public records. Others shouted that they had money riding on Shinji's team figuring it out. The three smiled, waved, and escaped back to their inn. Inside their room, they collapsed. Marc asked what they were supposed to do now. Shinji told him to let him rest first. They had expected floor 60 to be difficult, but the entire level had turned ugly. A Death Lord with a platoon of Death Knights had already been bad. Then the boss chamber revealed not one opponent but three. The knight who defeated them, the White King on the throne, and the dragon that never even had to join in. Zhen called them secret bosses, and nobody argued. Shinji focused on what mattered. Alberto had been far beyond them, and his gear was unique from head to toe. Marc had assumed the Minos Bardiche would cut through the next boss like an RPG reward doing its job. Instead, Alberto's cursed sword had stopped it cold. They had gotten full of themselves. The Masayuki rumors bothered them too. Masayuki's party had apparently never died in the dungeon, and Shinji suspected he had been warned about floor 60 somehow. If Masayuki had avoided that room on purpose, Shinji could understand why. Their spy work was now almost impossible. They were famous, publicly cheered, and tied to the dungeon's broadcast scene. But Shinji still had enough to report. The labyrinth was far too large to be natural. The route below floor 50 was much harder than it looked from outside. And something important had to be hidden beyond floor 60 because no one would guard an empty secret with monsters like that. They went outside town to a secluded place and sent their report to Yuuki. About 10 minutes later, Yuuki called back. He sounded amused that they had survived getting crushed. Shinji explained that they had no way past floor 60 on their own and would wait for Gadora's arrival before deciding their next move. Then Yuuki asked the real question, how strong was the floor 60 boss? Shinji understood what he meant. In Imperial terms, where would that opponent rank among the Imperial Guardians? He thought carefully. Shinji had never cared about climbing military ranks. He served Yuuki because Yuuki had picked him up and given him a place, and he preferred the army to organized crime. Plenty of other worlders in the East did the same sort of thing, avoiding attention and living as normally as possible. That made the official rankings imperfect. Even so, Shinji gave his answer. Alberto alone would make at least the top 50. Anyone lower would have no chance. Then Shinji added that he had once served as a medic during an anti-archdemon operation. The White King in the boss chamber had felt like that sort of magicule pressure. Yuuki immediately understood the reference, Crimson Shore. The Crimson Shore disaster was one of the Empire's darkest stories. It began with a small lakeside province rebelling against Imperial rule. The king was desperate. His daughter was about to be claimed by an Imperial noble as a concubine, and the province had no military chance against the Empire, so his court turned to forbidden demon summoning. They called an archdemon. The demon wanted the princess. When the head sorcerer saw its true power, his spirit broke, and he agreed. The demon possessed the princess, smiled, and turned the province into a massacre. By the time Imperial forces arrived, the lake had been stained red with the blood of the dead. Official history credited the armored division with stopping the demon. Shinji knew that was not the full truth. From a distance, he had seen a small group of soldiers do the real work. The whole response had felt suspiciously fast, as if the Empire had known more in advance than the public record admitted. Shinji never investigated further. That day taught him that some truths were better left alone. Back then, he had survived by playing dead and withdrawing early. As a medic, he had been useless. The demon's attacks killed instantly, leaving nothing to heal. Worse, Shinji remembered making eye contact with her once. Her eyes were blood-red, and he was still convinced she had simply let him go. So when he told Marc and Zhen that Adalmann's magicule pressure reminded him of that archdemon, they understood what he meant. The exact numbers were not the whole story. Strength was never just magicules. Skill, experience, matchup, and personality mattered too. But some beings existed beyond normal measurement, and Shinji wanted the other two to remember that. They sold their magic crystals and extra equipment at the Free Guild before closing. The staff recognized that the crystals came from deep floors and reacted with shock to the quality of the slotted weapons. One pure magisteel piece in particular would never be allowed on the public market in most countries. Shinji's group could probably have earned more by shopping around, but expanding their contacts was risky. The guild paid well enough. That single trip earned them more than 300 gold coins. The number forced another uncomfortable comparison. Imperial pay was stable, and otherworlders were treated better than ordinary soldiers. Marc and Zhen as first lieutenants did well enough. Shinji as a major with a medic qualification did better. But even combined, their yearly military salaries looked small beside what the dungeon had just paid them in days. They kept samples of the important equipment and sold the rest. Technically, loot obtained during military operations belonged to the armed forces unless permission was granted. But they were posing as adventurers and had been told to investigate the labyrinth. Selling loot was normal adventurer behavior, and Yuuki was unlikely to take anything he did not personally need. Still, Shinji finally said the quiet part out loud. If the Empire confiscated everything they earned here, they would have to seriously consider moving to Tempest. Marc and Zhen did not laugh this time. The thought was becoming practical. They had money. They had a place where death in the dungeon was not permanent. They had food, entertainment, hot springs, theater, sports, and work that suited their skills better than military service. Their only real obligation was to Yuuki, And Yuuki did not seem eager for conflict with Rimuru. Desertion was a crime in wartime, but the Empire was not officially at war yet. Maybe they could request discharge. Maybe Yuuki would allow it. Then Marc named the real problem: the war. If the Empire ordered them to attack this city, what would they do? The excellent dinner suddenly tasted flat. Shinji liked Tempest. All three of them did. They did not want to see it destroyed, and after Floor 60 they were no longer sure the Empire understood what it was attacking. Marc tried to reason it out. Surely Tempest would place its strongest monsters around its most important facilities. Surely the ordinary troops were weaker. They hoped so. Shinji was not comforted. Veldora had once destroyed a city, and after seeing Adalmann, Shinji no longer treated that as a legend. In his mind, beings like archdemons were this world's version of nuclear weapons. Against something like that, numbers stopped meaning much. Zhen quietly estimated that they would need dozens of fighters like themselves just to have a chance. All three of them sat with that thought. Then Gadora's magical call came.
Route confirmed. The next episode and full playlist are ready.
Then don't stop here. Keep watching in story order and subscribe before the next part drops.